Arguably, one of the closest times the world ever came to nuclear war was in 1957. You'll hear a lot about other times, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, or the 1983 Soviet false alarm when a satellite confused sunlight reflecting off of clouds from missile launches. But these were short instances and they were over quickly. In 1957, tensions had been building up for years, and discussions and plans were being made and seriously considered for a long time. To start, as World War II ended, there were serious tensions between the East and the West, with many expecting war to break out soon. The US and allies knew that they were massively outnumbered in Europe and they could not win a conventional war with the Soviets. The only advantage they actually had was in strategic bombers and nuclear weapons. And this shaped the thinking of the allies, especially the US, for the next several decades. They needed to maintain supremacy in both bombers and nuclear weapons if they were to stand a chance against the Soviet Union. By the mid-50s, the so-called bomber gap began. Due to a wrong estimation of Soviet bombers, the US feared that they were catching up or even about to surpass them. This led to a massive increase in US reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union. It got to a point where they were flying nearly every single day in 1956. And this made the Soviets furious, the US just repeatedly violating their airspace. Just think about how much news that one Chinese balloon made flying over the US a few years ago. Imagine that, but every single day. The bomber gap fear subsided with intelligence collected from these flights, but it also created a new fear: Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the US without any real chance of shooting them down. It turned out the Soviets were having real problems with developing their long-range bombers, so instead they went all in on ICBM efforts. They tested their first ICBM in May 1957 and then had their first successful one in August. The commander of Strategic Air Command, who was in charge of all the bombers and nearly all nuclear weapons, General Curtis LeMay, truly believed that a nuclear war with the Soviets was inevitable. The time the US would be able to wage a nuclear war against the Soviets without unacceptable losses was quickly closing. The Soviets had just started deploying the brand new S-75, or SA-2, along with air-to-air missiles, both of which would have wreaked havoc on bombers, and many thought it was either now or never. A lot of people accuse LeMay of being a madman, even wanting to start World War III. Whether that's true or not, the fact is that he could have. At the time, there were no PALs on nuclear weapons, which prevented their unauthorized use. If he really wanted to, General LeMay could have ordered a nuclear attack without anyone, including the president's authorization. So that sets the basic stage. Now a little bit about the forces involved. In late 1957, the US Strategic Air Command had 1,655 bombers, 766 tankers to support them and keep them in the air, extending their range, and they operated from 68 different air bases, 38 in the continental US and 30 overseas. It had 39 bomb wings, each of which typically consisted of 45 bombers. 28 of them were medium wings, which used the B-47. These could only carry a medium-sized payload and needed additional help from those tankers to reach the Soviet Union and get home. Then 11 heavy wings, which at the time were transitioning from the old B-36, which were really showing their age and they didn't have the speed required in the jet age, to the brand new B-52. All these wings had assigned home bases in the US, but as you can see, several would often deploy overseas. In late 1957, you can see, for example, 2 medium wings of B-47s were deployed in Morocco. A lot of people, including myself, had the idea that bombers were flying in the air 24/7, awaiting orders to turn in and strike, or even sitting at their air bases, fueled and armed and ready to go. But those ground alerts didn't actually start in full until a year later, and airborne alerts not until 1960, when only about a dozen bombers would be airborne at any given time. So even then, there weren't hundreds of bombers just waiting to turn in and strike. From the Soviet side, they had almost no realistic chance of bombing the US, except for Alaska. They actually had a decent number of bombers, close to that of the US, about 1,400, but they consisted mostly of the Tu-4 and the Tu-16. The Tu-4 was a reversed engineered copy of the US B-29 bombers that made emergency landings in the Soviet Union during World War II. So they were extremely outdated, slow, and they didn't have the range. The Tu-16 was more comparable to the US B-47. However, the Soviets lacked any aerial refueling capability in 1957, except for a few prototypes that they were testing. So neither would be able to reach the US, except if it was on a one-way trip knowing they couldn't return. That leaves their 2 heavy bombers, the M4 and the Tu-95. Both were brand new at the time and in small quantities, roughly 30 of each. Their bases were well inland though, and from those bases, just the Tu-95 could barely reach the US. If they were flown up to certain Arctic staging bases first to land and refuel, then the Tu-95 would have had the range to reach virtually anywhere in the US. but again, there's only 30 of them. So, unless they were planning on convincing all their pilots to fly one-way missions, they really had virtually zero chance of striking the US. Those bombers were better tasked with launching strikes across NATO nations in Europe than on one-way suicide missions. So, in a way, you can say this was kind of the last time that nuclear war could have been winnable. Winnable, in a sense, for the US, in that the US would have been able to destroy the Soviet Union without being struck themselves, but most of Europe would have become a wasteland. So what would a US nuclear attack on the Soviet Union in 1957 entail? Detailed lists of targets, even from the 1950s, are still classified. At the time of our scenario here, SN 344-55 was the war plan, enacted on the 1st of July 1957. Again, still classified, but enough has been released to get a good idea. In the 1950s, Strategic Air Command, or SAC, had 3 categories for targets. Bravo, which targeted Soviet nuclear forces. Romeo targets were Soviet Army advancing forces, like tank divisions. And then Delta, anything supporting the Soviet war effort. And this included everything from aircraft factories to oil refineries. General Curtis LeMay, again the commander of SAC at the time, didn't put much emphasis on Romeo. He thought fighting advancing ground forces was a tactical matter, not strategic, hence not the job of Strategic Air Command. So, how many targets were there? I went through a bunch of old documents and I've tried to map them out the best I could, which took way too long, so hopefully you enjoy it. Also, this here is only for the Soviet Union. To make it simpler, I left out the Warsaw Pact and China. I found about 80 sites connected to nuclear weapons. Here we have about 230 main industrial sites for things like military production, oil refineries, metalworking, machinery, tools, etc. Then there would also be the 200 plus Soviet Air Force bases that they would need to attack to degrade the Soviets' ability to shoot down their bombers. The Soviets at the time had roughly 5,000 fighter aircraft. These aircraft typically had combat ranges around 600 kilometers, which is the lighter circle. But realistically, given the ability to detect and intercept, the darker circle represents 400 kilometers. Then also not shown would be the huge number of things like command and control targets, headquarters, depots, staging areas, radars, and on and on and on. A declassified 1959 document that I found mentions a total of 4,609 DGZs, or designated ground zeros, which basically just means targets. That figure though does include Warsaw Pact countries and China, so in the Soviet Union alone, it was probably about half that. But those documents include lists of just hundreds and hundreds of pages of targets, just with the majority of their details and locations being redacted. But this all gives a pretty good picture of what the US and SAC would target. It gets infinitely more complex, such as in what order to attack these sites. For example, a Soviet nuclear bomber base would be a higher priority than a steel factory. Then breaking them down into further subcategories, planning how many and what types of nuclear bombs to use on each target, their reliability, damage criteria, and so on. But again, this gives a decent idea of what the US would try to strike. As you can see here, the vast majority of targets are in the western part of the Soviet Union, so this region would be the primary focus. There were 3 main general routes US bombers would take. First being across the Mediterranean from overseas SAC bases, like those in Morocco. These would refuel in air along the way and then fly out to strike their targets in the southwest, including in modern-day Ukraine. The second would mostly follow up along the east coast of North America, over Greenland, refueling along the way, and then down into the northwestern Soviet Union. And then finally was along the west coast of North America, up over Alaska, to strike targets in the east and deep down in the southern section of the Soviet Union. What most people don't realize is that this wouldn't just be one single massive wave of bombers. You couldn't just fly in and bomb Moscow. Soviet defenses were too numerous, so numerous waves were planned, each striking deeper and deeper targets. Soviet air bases would typically be struck first. That way, each successive wave would be able to safely bomb those other sites, like industry. Meanwhile, the next wave would proceed striking deeper air bases, and so on and so forth. This progressive bombing campaign would not be over quickly. It was expected to last for several days, just slowly advancing deeper and deeper, and at the same time reassessing as they went along and conduct follow-up strikes on new targets that appeared, targets that were missed, and those that were deemed not adequately destroyed. It really was crazy. And the Soviet Union with an estimated 5,000 plus fighter aircraft trying to shoot down those bombers. And 2 major game changers, making the bomber's job more difficult, had just began operational service this year. The first were air-to-air missiles, specifically the Soviet K-5. It was short range, not very reliable, and being brand new meant that it was only available in small numbers, but it would decrease the chances a bomber would have to make it to its target and get home. An even bigger game changer though were surface-to-air missiles. The Soviets deployed their first system, the S-25, or SA-1 in NATO names, in 1955, but it was only deployed around Moscow. The big change was the S-75, or SA-2. It also became operational in mid-1957 and began rapidly being deployed across the Soviet Union. By 1962, they had over 300 sites. In late 1957, though, it was likely a few dozen at most. Either way, all these things made the bomber's job so much more difficult. I mean, it was pretty much the equivalent of walking up to a hornet's nest and slapping it. Different methods of bombing would slightly increase the bomber's chances, but not by much. Low-altitude bombing was one. It made them harder to detect early, but then you were within reach of the estimated 8,000 to 10,000 anti-aircraft guns the Soviet Union had. And then, even if you made it in and were able to drop your bombs, flying so low you might get caught in the blast wave. Toss bombing was another one that limited those problems. You didn't need to fly directly over your target, and it gave you more time to escape the nuclear blast. However, SAC discontinued training with toss bombing a few years earlier because of the high stresses that it caused in the B-47s shortened their life, even resulting in the wings being torn off on a few occasions. Some have tried to estimate the odds of a bomber's survival and actually succeeding in its mission, dropping its bombs on its target, and then safely returning home. Numbers vary greatly, but it's often only around 50% actually reaching and bombing their targets. Then only half of them making it out and back home. If true, that would mean that the US could expect to lose 75% of its bombers on each mission. After the first mission, they'd be down from 1,655 to just 414. A second flight would see those numbers drop to just 104, then 26. Again, estimates vastly differ, and likely survival rates would improve as defenses are degraded, but thank God we never had to find out. As 1957 ended, things changed in massive ways. As the Soviets deployed more surface-to-air missile systems and more interceptors carrying air-to-air missiles, along with improvements in radar, the ability of US bombers to reach their targets decreased drastically. Losses would very quickly become unsustainable, but by far the biggest game changer was ICBMs. Both the US and Soviet Union tested their first ICBM in 1957, the Atlas and the R-7, both becoming operational in early 1959. At that point, no longer could the US hope to remain untouched in a nuclear war. As the years went on, the bomber's role diminished. Strategic Air Command went from a 1959 high of 1,854 bombers, and by 1969 it shrank to just 505. Today, the ICBM and the submarine-based SLBM are the main weapons for nuclear warfare. For half a century now, no one has been able to come up with a better idea on how to seriously counter them at scale. If you can come up with a better idea, besides just trying to ban them, which is pointless as you'll never get everyone to agree to it, they just give way too much of an advantage, you could very quickly become a billionaire.